In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where countless civilizations rise and fall like cosmic dust, there exists a universal truth that every sentient being understands. Fear is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're a crystalline entity that communicates through harmonic frequencies, a plasma-based consciousness that dances between stars, or a silicon-based hive mind that thinks in mathematical equations. When death stares you in the face, when the void threatens to claim your essence, fear finds you. I am Zektar of the Vraxian Collective, a warrior caste member of one of the galaxy's most feared military hierarchies. For 3 centuries, I have carved my name across battlefields that span solar systems. I have faced the acid-spitting Corvins in the sulfur mines of Arcturus 7. I have stood against the mechanical horrors of the Synth-Arch Legion in the ruins of fallen worlds. I have watched entire fleets burn in the cold vacuum of space, and felt nothing but the satisfaction of victory. Fear? It was a concept I knew only in theory, something that happened to lesser beings, to prey species, to those weak enough to let emotion cloud their judgment. My people, the Vraxians, had evolved beyond such primitive responses. We were apex predators, genetically engineered for warfare, mentally conditioned to face any threat with cold calculation. Or so I believed. Everything changed when I first fought alongside humanity. In those blood-soaked trenches on a forgotten world at the edge of known space, I discovered that terror isn't just an emotion, it's a revelation. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't your enemy. Sometimes, it's your ally. This is the story of how I learned to be afraid, and why that knowledge saved not just my life, but the lives of countless others across the galaxy. This is the story of why humans are the most dangerous species in the known universe. Not because of their weapons, not because of their technology, but because of something far more primal and infinitely more powerful. This is the story of the day I understood why the galaxy whispers their name in the darkness between stars. The first time Zektar laid eyes on a human, he was convinced the Galactic Military Command had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The creature stood barely 2 meters tall, its pale pink skin seemingly devoid of any natural armor or protective carapace. Where Zektar's own Vraxian physiology boasted reinforced bone, plates beneath his dark blue hide, redundant organ systems, and natural weapons in the form of retractable claws and venomous spines, this human appeared laughably fragile. "You've got to be kidding me," Zektar muttered in his native tongue, his secondary vocal cords producing the harmonics that conveyed his disgust. The translation device, embedded in his skull, immediately converted his words to galactic standard, though it stripped away much of the emotional nuance. The human, introduced as Captain Sarachon of the Terran Defense Force, turned toward him with an expression Zektar couldn't quite interpret. Her small, round eyes seemed to take in every detail of his imposing 2.5-meter frame, from his armored carapace to the ceremonial scars that marked his rank as a third-tier battlemaster. Yet instead of the appropriate fear or reverence, she simply nodded once and extended her hand in what Zektar's cultural database informed him was a greeting gesture. "Pleasure to meet you, Battlemaster," she said, her voice carrying an odd quality that made Zektar's combat instincts twitch. There was something predatory in the undertone, something that didn't match her species' apparent physical weakness. "I've heard impressive things about Vraxian combat capabilities." Zektar stared at the offered hand for a moment before reluctantly extending one of his own appendages, careful to keep his claws retracted. The human's grip was surprisingly firm, though he could have crushed her delicate bones with minimal effort. When she released his hand, he noticed she showed no sign of discomfort despite the obvious strength differential. The briefing chamber aboard the Joint Operations vessel Concordia hummed with a quiet efficiency of military preparation. Representatives from a dozen different species sat around the holographic display table, their varied forms creating an almost comical contrast. There were the insectoid Clixians with their chittering mandibles, the crystalline Epherians who communicated through light patterns, several other Vraxian warriors like himself, and, scattered throughout, more humans. Admiral Karath, a fellow Vraxian and Zektar's superior officer, activated the central hologram with a gesture of his primary manipulator. The image that materialized above the table made even the battle-hardened warriors present shift uncomfortably. It showed the contested world of Kepler 442b, but the planet's surface was barely recognizable beneath the sprawling metallic growth that covered nearly 40% of its landmass. The Devourers have established a primary hive on Kepler 442b, Admiral Karath announced, his voice carrying the weight of grim authority. Intelligence estimates suggest they've been consuming the planet's resources for approximately 6 standard months. If we allow them to reach critical mass, they'll launch spore ships to the surrounding systems. Zektar felt his combat glands automatically begin secreting the pre-battle hormones that would enhance his reflexes and pain tolerance. The Devourers were one of the galaxy's most feared enemies, a quasi-organic machine intelligence that consumed entire worlds, breaking down matter at the molecular level to fuel their expansion. They were relentless, adaptable, and had already consumed 14 inhabited systems before the various galactic powers had put aside their differences to form this emergency alliance. Captain Chun leaned forward, her small fingers dancing across the hologram controls to zoom in on specific sections of the planetary surface. What's our insertion strategy? The hive structures they're showing here suggest at least Class 7 defensive capabilities. Direct orbital bombardment is ineffective, Admiral Karath replied. The Devourers have developed adaptive shielding that actually grows stronger under sustained energy assault. We need boots on the ground to locate and destroy their primary processing nodes. How many boots? Asked Cliction Battle Commander Thrixhe, his translated voice carrying the characteristic buzz of a species. 40,000 initial deployment across 12 landing zones, Karath answered. Mixed species combat teams, each with specialized objectives. The terrain analysis suggests we'll be fighting in everything from underground tunnel systems to high-altitude platforms. Zektar studied the tactical display, his experienced eye immediately identifying the challenges they would face. The Devourers didn't just consume matter, they reshaped it. Every building, every piece of infrastructure they touched became part of their hive network. Fighting them meant navigating an enemy that could literally reshape the battlefield in real time. Projected casualties? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 73%, Admiral Karath said quietly. This is a one-way mission for most of us. But if we fail here, the Devourers reach their exponential growth phase. After that, nothing short of nova-bombing inhabited systems will stop them. The chamber fell silent. Even for warriors bred for battle, those odds were sobering. Zektar had led assaults with poor survival chances before, but never anything quite this desperate. Around the table, he could see other commanders making the same calculations, weighing their duty against their survival instincts. That's when Captain Shin spoke up again. My people have some experience with impossible odds, she said, her tone almost conversational. We'd like to volunteer for one of the high-risk objectives. Zektar couldn't help but let out a harsh laugh that translated poorly through his vocal apparatus. With respect, Captain, your species appears to lack the necessary physical adaptations for this type of warfare. Perhaps a support role, Battlemaster Zektar. Admiral Karath interrupted, and there was a warning in his tone that made Zektar immediately fall silent. The human military record speaks for itself. Captain Chin's unit has successfully completed 7 separate operations against numerically superior forces in the past year alone. Against what kind of opposition? Sektar Falingit. How does fighting other soft-bodied primitives prepare them for the Devourers? Captain Chin's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. To most of the other species present, the change would have been unnoticeable, but Zektar's predator heritage made him acutely sensitive to the body language of potential threats. Every instinct he possessed suddenly screamed danger. 6 months ago, we cleared a Devourer scout ship that had infiltrated the Tau Ceti system, she said, her voice maintaining its casual tone despite what felt like a significant change in atmospheric pressure around her. Took us 18 hours to burn through their adaptive defenses and reach the control nodes. Lost 12% of our unit, but we stopped them from sending their data burst back to the main hive. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Zektar realized that several of the other commanders were looking at Captain Chun with expressions he recognized as professional respect, mixed with unease. You fought Devourers? Cliction Battle Commander Thrixhe asked, his translated voice carrying a note of what might have been disbelief. Fought, and won, Chun replied simply. Turns out they have trouble adapting to certain types of asymmetric warfare. Their hive intelligence is designed to counter organized military tactics, but it struggles with creative improvisation. Admiral Karath manipulated the hologram to highlight one particular section of the planet's surface, a massive spire that twisted up from the hive structure like a metallic mountain. This is primary node 7, he announced. Intelligence suggests it's one of their main coordination hubs. Taking it out would severely disrupt their defensive network across the northern continent. It's also the most heavily defended position on the planet, added a voice from across the table. Commander Valdris, another Vraxian whose battle scars marked him as a veteran of the Corvex Wars, gestured toward the defensive emplacements visible around the spire's base. Estimated defensive strength puts it beyond the capabilities of any single species' forces, which is why this will be a joint operation, Admiral Karath continued. A combined task force with representatives from all participating species. Battlemaster Zektar, you'll be leading the Vraxian contingent. Zektar nodded, already beginning to plan the tactical approach. Vraxian warriors were ideally suited for this type of assault. Their natural armor could withstand significant punishment. Their redundant biological systems meant they could continue fighting even after sustaining wounds that would incapacitate other species, and their pack-hunting instincts made them effective team fighters. Captain Chun, Admiral Karath continued, your unit will provide tactical support and creative problem-solving. That phrase, creative problem-solving, stuck in Zektar's mind as the briefing continued. He'd never heard military doctrine described quite that way before. In Vraxian culture, warfare was approached with scientific precision. You identified your enemy's capabilities, calculated their weaknesses, and applied overwhelming force at the optimal moment. There is little room for creativity when lives hung in the balance. After the briefing, as the various commanders dispersed to prepare their units, Zektar found himself walking alongside Captain Chun toward the ship's armory sections. She moved with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with her species' apparent physical limitations, each step economical and purposeful. Battlemaster, she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. I understand you have concerns about human capabilities. Zektar considered his response carefully. Direct honesty was valued in Vraxian culture, but he learned that other species sometimes found their bluntness offensive. Your people appear to lack the natural advantages that evolution has granted other warrior species, he said finally. I'm concerned about maintaining unit cohesion when some team members may require additional protection. Captain Shin stopped walking and turned to face him fully. For the first time, Zektar got a good look at her eyes, and what he saw there made his combat instincts flare again. There was an intelligence in those eyes, certainly, but beneath that was something else. Something that reminded him of the look in a pack alpha's eyes just before it struck. You know what I think the problem is? She said, her tone remaining conversational despite the predatory gleam in her expression. Most species evolved to fill a specific niche. You Vraxians became perfect pack hunters, fast, strong, well-armored, with all the natural weapons you could ask for. The Clixians developed their hive coordination abilities. The Ephirians evolved their crystalline durability. She resumed walking, and Zektar found himself following despite his growing unease. But humans, she continued, we didn't evolve to fill a specific ecological niche. We evolved to take over all of them. We're not the fastest or the strongest or the most durable, but we're adaptable in ways that most species can't comprehend. And when you're adaptable enough, you don't need natural weapons. They'd reached the armory section, and Captain Shin palmed the access panel with casual familiarity. The chamber beyond was filled with weapons and equipment from a dozen different worlds, everything from Vraxian plasma rifles to Ephirian crystal resonators. Because, she said, selecting what appeared to be a completely unremarkable human projectile weapon from one of the racks, you just make better ones. The weapon in her hands looked primitive compared to the advanced energy weapons surrounding it. But as she began field stripping it with practiced efficiency, Zektar found himself paying attention despite his skepticism. Her movements were precise, economical, and spoke of countless hours of familiarity. Kinetic projectile weapon, she explained as she worked. Chemical propellant, metal projectile, completely mechanical operation. Probably looks pretty basic compared to your plasma rifles. It does, Zektar admitted, studying the simple construction. The Devourer's adaptive shielding is designed to counter energy weapons, Chun continued, reassembling the weapon with the same fluid precision. They analyzed the energy pattern, matched its frequency, and developed countermeasures within minutes. But this? She patted the completed weapon fondly. This fires a chunk of metal really, really fast. No energy pattern to analyze, no frequency to match. Just kinetic energy and the laws of physics. Zektar felt something shift in his assessment of the human captain. The weapon was indeed primitive, but there was an elegant simplicity to the concept that appealed to his tactical mind. Effective range, he asked. Depends on the ammunition, Chen replied, selecting several different types of projectiles from a nearby storage container. Standard rounds for general combat, armor-piercing for hardened targets, explosive rounds for structural damage. And these? She held up a projectile that seemed to shimmer with an oily, rainbow-colored coating. Experimental rounds designed specifically for devourer physiology. What do? Captain Chen's smile was small and cold. They disrupt the molecular bonds in their bioform components. Causes cascade failure in their self-repair systems. She paused, studying the ammunition with professional interest. We tested them on captured devourer samples. Very effective. For the first time since meeting her, Zektar began to understand why Admiral Karath spoke of human capabilities with such respect. The idea of developing specialized ammunition to counter an enemy's specific biological processes showed a level of tactical thinking that impressed him. How long did it take to develop these rounds? He asked. About 2 weeks after we first encountered devourer samples, Chen replied casually, as if creating entirely new weapons on that timeline was perfectly normal. Sector Sterdotar? 2 weeks. Our research teams work fast when they're motivated, she said with that same small smile. And nothing motivates human research teams quite like an existential threat to our species. As they continued through the armory, Captain Shun introduced him to more examples of human military innovation. Weapons that used principles he'd never encountered, tactics that seemed to ignore conventional military wisdom, and equipment that looked deceptively simple until she explained its function. But it wasn't just the technology that began to shift his opinion of humanity. It was the way Captain Shun discussed warfare itself, where Zektar had been trained to think in terms of honor, glory, and the noble traditions of his warrior caste. Chen spoke about war as a problem to be solved. Every enemy was a puzzle to be analyzed, every weakness a flaw to be exploited, every advantage a resource to be leveraged. The thing about humans, she said as they concluded their tour of the armory, is that we've been fighting each other for our entire evolutionary history. We've faced every possible type of enemy. Fast ones, strong ones, smart ones, numerous ones. We've learned to win wars against opponents who had every natural advantage you can imagine. She paused at the armory exit, turning to face him again with that predatory gleam back in her eyes. So when we encounter something like the Devourers, something that thinks it's the ultimate predator, we don't see an unstoppable force. We see another puzzle to solve. And we're very, very good at solving puzzles. As Zektar made his way back to his quarters to prepare his own equipment for the coming mission, he found himself thinking about Captain Chen's words. The confidence in her voice hadn't been bravado. It was the quiet certainty of someone who had faced impossible odds before and found a way to win. For the first time since learning about the Devourer threat, Zektar began to feel something other than grim resignation about their chances. It wasn't quite hope. His warrior training made him too practical for that kind of optimism. But it was curiosity. He was curious to see what humans looked like when they went to war. He was about to find out that curiosity could be a dangerous thing. The drop ship shuddered as it hit the planet's atmosphere, its hull groaning under the stress of atmospheric entry, while enemy fire streaked past the viewports like deadly fireworks. Zektar gripped his restraint harness and watched the tactical display as their formation of 40 vessels descended through the Devourer's defensive perimeter. 3 ships had already been destroyed, their icons blinking out of existence on the display with clinical finality. Across from him, Captain Shin sat with her eyes closed, breathing in a slow, measured rhythm that seemed completely at odds with the chaos erupting around their descending craft. Her human squad, 12 soldiers in total, displayed the same unnatural calm. Where Zektar's Vraxian warriors were running through final equipment checks and reciting battle prayers to their ancestors, the humans seemed to have entered some kind of meditative state. Incoming plasma burst, announced the pilot's voice over the comm system. The ship lurched violently to port, and Zektar heard something in the hull crack under the strain. Emergency lights flickered as backup systems engaged. Captain Chen's eyes opened. In the red emergency lighting, they looked almost black. "How long to touchdown?" she asked, her voice cutting through the noise of straining engines and distant explosions with a clarity that made Zektar's combat senses sharpen. "For minutes," came the pilot's reply. "But we're taking heavy fire. I can't guarantee we'll make it to the primary landing zone." "Then put us down wherever you can," Chen responded. "We'll adapt." That word again, adapt. Zektar was beginning to understand that humans used it the way other species might use words like fight or survive. It wasn't just about changing tactics. It was about becoming something different entirely when the situation demanded it. The tactical display updated to show their new landing coordinates, approximately 3 kilometers from their intended insertion point, in what the pre-mission intelligence had classified as a contested zone. Translation: they were landing directly in the middle of active Devourer territory, with no backup and no clear route to their objective. Zektar's squad leader instincts kicked in. "Chun," he called over the comm, "we need to reassess our approach. Landing that far from the objective means we get to see what Devourer patrols look like up close," Chen interrupted, and there was something in her voice that made Zektar pause. "Means we get intelligence the other units won't have. Means we get to test our new toys before the main event." She gestured to her squad, and Zektar watched as they began a final equipment check that was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Where Vraxian pre-battle rituals focused on honor and ancestral guidance, the humans moved with mechanical precision, each soldier verifying their teammates' gear in a choreographed sequence that spoke of countless hours of practice. But it was the equipment itself that caught Zektar's attention. Along with the primitive kinetic weapons Chun had shown him in the armory, each human carried devices that his combat experience couldn't immediately categorize. Some looked like communication equipment, others resembled medical supplies, and still others appeared to be construction tools rather than weapons. "What is all that gear?" he asked, his natural curiosity overcoming military protocol. Sergeant Williams, Chen's second-in-command, looked up from checking what appeared to be a compact mining laser. "Adaptation kit," he replied with a grin that showed entirely too many teeth. "Never know what you're going to need until you need it." 1 minute to touchdown, the pilot announced. "Brace for impact. The landing is going to be rough." Zektar felt his redundant cardiovascular systems automatically adjust his blood pressure and oxygen distribution for combat operations. Around him, his Vraxian warriors were entering their own biological war state, their natural armor hardening and their reflexes accelerating as combat hormones flooded their systems. The humans, by contrast, seemed to become even calmer. Zektar watched Captain Chen's breathing slow further, her posture relaxing into something that looked almost meditative. But her eyes remained sharp and alert, tracking the tactical display and monitoring her squad with the focused attention of a predator selecting targets. The drop ship hit the ground hard, the impact throwing everyone against their restraints with bone-jarring force. Emergency klaxons wailed as the pilot ran through emergency shutdown procedures, and the smell of burning electronics filled the cabin atmosphere. "All units, sound off," Chen commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. Zektar listened as the humans reported their status in crisp, efficient terms. No wasted words, no emotional responses to their rough landing, just tactical information delivered with machine-like precision. His own warriors were taking longer to assess their condition, still shaking off the effects of the crash. "Vraxian squad, status report," he ordered, falling back on familiar military protocol. "All warriors operational," replied his second, battle brother Krigstar. "Minor injuries only. Equipment intact." Captain Chun was already moving toward the drop ship's exit ramp, her squad falling in behind her with fluid coordination. "Battlemaster Zektar," she called back, "recommend we establish a defensive perimeter while we assess the local situation." The ramp lowered with a hiss of hydraulics, revealing the alien landscape of Kepler 442b's surface. What had once been a thriving colony world now looked like something from a nightmare. The ground itself seemed to pulse with a sickly organic rhythm, its surface covered with the metallic biological hybrid material that marked Devourer infestation. Twisted spires reached toward the clouded sky like grasping fingers, and in the distance, Zektar could see the movement of Devourer units, biomechanical constructs that combine the worst aspects of machine precision and organic adaptability. Captain Chun stepped off the ramp first, her weapon ready, but not raised, her posture alert, but not aggressive. To Zektar's trained eye, she looked like a hunter entering unfamiliar territory, cautious but confident, ready for anything but not afraid of what she might find. The air outside carried a metallic taste that made Zektar's enhanced senses recoil. The atmospheric processors the Devourers had constructed were slowly converting the planet's atmosphere to better suit their needs, introducing trace elements that were toxic to most carbon-based life. His warrior physiology could handle the contamination for several hours, but extended exposure would eventually overwhelm even Vraxian biological resistance. Air quality is marginal, he reported through the comm system. Recommend limiting exposure time. Copy that, Chen replied, but she didn't sound concerned. Instead, she was studying the twisted landscape around their landing site with the same professional interest she'd shown when examining weapons in the armory. Sergeant Williams, what do you think? Processing center or defensive node? Williams knelt and placed one hand on the pulsing ground, closing his eyes for a moment as if listening to something. Processing center, he replied after a pause. The rhythm is wrong for a defensive node. This is metabolic activity. Zektar stared at him. How could you possibly know that? Human hearing is different from most species, Chen explained, her attention still focused on the surrounding terrain. We can detect subtle audio patterns that other species miss. Biological systems have distinctive acoustic signatures. She pointed toward a cluster of the twisted spires that rose from the infected ground about half a kilometer away. Those are definitely defensive nodes, she continued. You can hear the harmonic resonance from the power systems. And she gestured toward another area where the ground seemed to ripple and flow like liquid metal. That's a communication hub. The electromagnetic interference has a specific pattern. Zektar activated his own sensory enhancement systems, pushing his hearing to its maximum sensitivity. He could detect some of what Captain Chen was describing, but it required focused effort and technological assistance. For her, it seemed to be as natural as breathing. Movement, reported Corporal Davies from his position near the drop ship's damaged sensor array. Multiple contacts approaching from the northwest. Range approximately 800 meters and closing. Chen's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The calm, analytical observer vanished, replaced by something that made Zektar's predator instincts scream warnings. She didn't move faster or speak louder, but something fundamental changed in her presence. It was as if a switch had been thrown, transforming her from a professional soldier into something far more dangerous. How many? She asked, her voice carrying a new edge. Visual confirmation on 6 units, Davies replied. Standard Devourer Scout configuration. Part biological, part mechanical. Estimated approach time, 3 minutes. Zektar felt his own combat systems engaging, flooding his body with the chemicals that would enhance his speed and strength for battle. We should establish defensive positions, he suggested, falling back on standard Vraxian tactics. Find elevated ground and create overlapping fields of fire. Captain Chen shook her head. Defensive positions won't work against scouts, she said, already signaling her squad into a formation Zektar didn't recognize. They're designed to probe defenses and report back to the hive. If we give them time to analyze our capabilities, every devourer on this continent will know exactly how to counter us. Then what do you suggest? That predatory smile was back, and this time it made Zektar's scales actually stand on end. We don't let them report back. What happened next challenged everything Zektar thought he knew about small unit tactics. Instead of seeking cover or establishing defensive positions, Captain Chen's squad began moving toward the approaching enemies. But they didn't advance in any formation he recognized from his military training. Instead, they seemed to melt into the twisted landscape, each soldier finding concealment in ways that shouldn't have been possible on the alien terrain. Zektar watched Sergeant Williams disappear into a cluster of metallic growths that couldn't possibly provide adequate cover for a being his size. Corporal Davies seemed to vanish entirely behind a formation of twisted metal that looked far too small to hide him. One by one, the human soldiers became invisible, not through technology or natural camouflage, but through sheer tactical skill. Where did they go? Battle Brother Krixtar asked, his voice carrying the confusion that Zektar felt. They're adapting, Chin's voice came through the comm, though Zektar couldn't see her anywhere in the surrounding landscape. The Devourers expect conventional military tactics. They're prepared for direct assault, defensive positions, and standard movement patterns. They're not prepared for what we're about to do, which is what exactly? Guerrilla warfare, came the reply, and there was something almost gleeful in her tone. Hit and run tactics, asymmetric engagement, creative problem solving. The first Devourer scout emerged from behind a cluster of spires, and Zektar got his first close look at the enemy they'd come to fight. The creature was a nightmare fusion of organic tissue and mechanical components, standing roughly 3 meters tall on 4 articulated legs that ended in razor-sharp talons. Its torso was partially organic, partially armored with the same metallic biological hybrid material that covered the planet's surface. Multiple sensory organs protruded from what might charitably be called its head, each one sweeping the terrain in different spectrums. It was, by any objective measure, a formidable opponent. Faster than most species, heavily armored, equipped with built-in weapons systems, and backed by the collective intelligence of the Devourer hive mind. In a direct confrontation, it could probably take down several Vraxian warriors before being overwhelmed. The scout never had a chance for a direct confrontation. The attack came from 6 directions simultaneously, and it was over before Zektar fully understood what was happening. One moment, the Devourer was scanning the area with its multiple sensors. The next, it was collapsing as kinetic rounds tore through its hybrid physiology with surgical precision. But it wasn't just the speed of the attack that impressed him, it was the coordination. Each human soldier had targeted a specific component of the scout's anatomy. The rounds struck its sensory organs, its communication array, and its locomotive systems in a precise sequence that left it unable to fight back, unable to flee, and unable to transmit intelligence back to the hive. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Target down, came Sergeant Williams' calm voice over the comm, moving to intercept remaining scouts. Zektar realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. The humans weren't just fighting the Devourers, they were hunting them. Each engagement was a carefully orchestrated ambush that denied the enemy any opportunity to gather intelligence or mount an effective response. Over the next 10 minutes, he watched as Captain Chen's squad systematically eliminated the entire scout patrol without suffering a single casualty. But, more importantly, they did it in a way that prevented the scouts from reporting back to the hive. As far as the Devourer collective intelligence was concerned, this area of the planet remained unoccupied. When the last scout fell, the human soldiers seemed to materialize out of the twisted landscape as if they'd never been hidden at all. They moved with efficient purpose, each one checking the fallen Devourers for useful intelligence while maintaining security overwatch. Interesting, Captain Chen said, kneeling beside one of the destroyed scouts and examining its communication array with professional curiosity. The signal encryption is more sophisticated than our intelligence suggested. She produced what looked like a standard human engineering tool and began carefully extracting components from the scout's communication system. Sergeant Williams, I need a full spectrum analysis on this transmitter. Davies, check their sensory equipment. I want to know what wavelengths they're using for detection. Zektar approached cautiously, his respect for human capabilities growing with each passing minute. What are you doing? Learning, Chen replied simply. Every piece of Devourer technology we capture teaches us something new about how they operate. And everything we learned makes us more effective against them. She held up a crystalline component that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. This, for example, is their memory storage matrix. It contains everything the scout observed in the last 72 hours. With the right equipment, we can extract that data and use it to understand their patrol patterns, their communication protocols, and their defensive priorities. Is that standard human military doctrine? Zektar asked, genuinely curious. To analyze enemy technology during active combat operations? Captain Chen's laugh was short and sharp. Standard human doctrine is to do whatever works, she said. If studying our enemies makes us better at killing them, then we study our enemies. If being unpredictable gives us an advantage, then we embrace unpredictability. If breaking the rules helps us win, she shrugged. Then we break the rules. As they prepared to move toward their actual objective, the massive spire that served as primary node 7, Zektar found himself reassessing not just human capabilities, but his own understanding of warfare itself. His Vraxian heritage had taught him to value honor in combat, to face his enemies directly, and to rely on superior physical capabilities to achieve victory. But watching the humans work, he began to understand that there were other forms of strength. Intelligence applied with ruthless efficiency. Adaptability that turned every obstacle into an advantage. And a willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect their species, regardless of traditional concepts of honor or fair play. As they moved across the infected landscape toward their target, Zektar found himself looking forward to the main assault with a mixture of anticipation and unease. He was beginning to understand what Admiral Karath had meant when he spoke of human capabilities with such respect. But he was also beginning to understand why something in his predator instincts continued to identify these humans as dangerous, not just to their enemies, but potentially to anyone who underestimated what they were capable of when pushed to their limits. The real battle was still ahead of them, and Zektar was starting to suspect that he was about to see something that would change his understanding of warfare forever. Primary Node 7 rose before them, like a monument to alien nightmare, its twisted spire stretching nearly 2 kilometers into the poisoned sky. The structure defied conventional architectural understanding. Part grown, part built, part something else entirely. Its surface rippled with the same organic metallic hybrid material that covered the rest of the infected planet. But here the material seemed more alive, pulsing with energy patterns that made the air itself hum with malevolent power. Zektar crouched beside Captain Shun at the edge of their concealment, studying the target through his enhanced vision systems. The approaches to the spire were defended by more Devourer units than he'd ever seen in one place. Hundreds of the biomechanical constructs moving in patterns that suggested hive-level coordination. Some were the scouts they'd encountered earlier, but many others were clearly specialized for different roles. There were massive artillery units that looked like walking gun platforms, aerial units that drifted through the toxic atmosphere on gossamer wings of living metal, and heavy assault units whose armored carapaces could probably shrug off direct hits from Vraxian plasma rifles. Frontal assault is suicide, he muttered, running tactical calculations through his enhanced neural processors. We'd need at least a full battalion to have any chance of breaking through those defenses, and even then, the casualties would be catastrophic. Captain Shun was studying the same defenses, but her expression suggested she was seeing something entirely different. You're thinking like a traditional military force, she said quietly. Frontal assault, overwhelming firepower, acceptable losses in exchange for territorial objectives. She shifted position slightly, pointing toward different areas of the spire's defensive perimeter. But look at how they've organized their defenses. Classic hub and spoke pattern with overlapping fields of fire designed to counter massed infantry assault. Artillery positioned to provide indirect fire support. Mobile units patrol routes optimized for detecting and intercepting conventional military formations. Zektar followed her pointing finger and gradually began to see what she meant. The Devourer defenses were indeed perfectly arranged to counter the kind of assault that any sane military commander would launch against such a target. So we can't attack it, he concluded. We can't attack it the way they expect us to attack it, Chen corrected. But the beautiful thing about expectations is that they create blind spots. And humans are very, very good at exploiting blind spots. She activated her tactical display, overlaying it with data her squad had collected during their approach to the target. Sergeant Williams, what did your analysis of the communication network reveal? Williams consulted his portable scanner, its screen displaying patterns of electromagnetic activity that Zektar couldn't interpret. Standard hive mind protocols, Captain. All defensive units are receiving updates from the Central Coordination Node every 14 seconds. Response time to threat detection averages 6.3 seconds across all unit types. And the patrol patterns? Optimized for detecting groups of 5 or more hostiles moving in coordinated formation, Williams replied. They're also scanning for energy signatures consistent with military-grade weapons and equipment. Captain Chen nodded, as if this information confirmed something she'd already suspected. What about individual infiltrators? Solo operators or very small groups? Minimal coverage, Williams admitted. Their sensor grid has gaps that could accommodate 1 or 2 individuals moving with proper stealth protocols. Zektar felt a chill run down his spinal ridge as he began to understand what Sean was suggesting. You're planning to infiltrate the spire. Just the 2 of you. Not just the 2 of us, Chin replied with that predatory smile he was learning to associate with particularly dangerous ideas. All of us. But not together, not as a coordinated military unit. As individuals, moving independently, using different approaches and different timing. She manipulated her tactical display to show the spire from multiple angles, highlighting potential infiltration routes that would never occur to a conventional military planner. The Devourers expect us to behave like a military force because that's how every other species approaches warfare. We organize into units, we coordinate our movements, we follow doctrine and establish tactical principles. Because that's how military operations work, Zektar protested. Coordination and mutual support are what keeps soldiers alive in combat situations. For most species, yes, Chen agreed. But humans learned warfare fighting against other humans. And the thing about fighting your own species is that conventional tactics don't work. Your enemy knows them as well as you do. So we had to learn to think outside conventional military doctrine. She zoomed in on one particular section of the spire's base, where the organic architecture created a maze of irregular passages and chambers. 12 individuals, moving independently, using 12 different infiltration routes, targeting 12 different systems within the spire structure. No coordination, no mutual support, no conventional military organization. That's not a military operation, Zektar said, his warrior training rebelling against the entire concept. That's suicide. No, Chen replied quietly. That's guerrilla warfare. And it's what humans do best. Over the next hour, Zektar watched as Captain Chen's squad prepared for an operation that violated every principle of military science he'd ever learned. Instead of coordinating their approach, each soldier planned their own individual infiltration route. Instead of maintaining communication, they programmed their equipment to operate in total radio silence. Instead of mutual support and coordinated timing, each soldier would act independently based on their own assessment of the tactical situation. It was, by every standard Zektar knew, a recipe for disaster. But, as he observed the preparations, he began to notice something that challenged his assumptions. The human soldiers weren't just randomly improvising. They were adapting their individual capabilities to specific aspects of the mission in ways that suggested a level of tactical thinking he'd never encountered before. Sergeant Williams, for example, had configured his equipment for electronic warfare operations. His goal wasn't to destroy Devourer's systems, but to introduce subtle malfunctions that would cascade through the Hive network, creating confusion and disrupting coordination. Corporal Davies had loaded his weapon with the specialized anti-Devourer ammunition Chun had shown Zektar in the armory, but he'd also packed demolition charges designed to target structural weak points that would cause maximum damage to the spire's internal architecture. Each soldier had become a specialist in a different aspect of the mission, but instead of working together as a team, they would be working independently toward the same objective. It was like watching a military unit dissolve into its component parts, each part optimized for a different function. Battlemaster, Captain Chen said, approaching him as his own warriors made their final preparations. I need to ask something of you that you're not going to like. Zektar turned his attention to her, noting that her equipment loadout was different from her soldiers. Where they carried specialized gear for their individual missions, she seemed to have prepared for general combat operations. What do you need? I need you and your warriors to create a distraction, she said. A big, obvious conventional military assault that draws the Devourer's attention away from the spire itself. Zektar's combat clause extended involuntarily. You want us to conduct a suicide attack so that you can sneak into the spire undetected. Not suicide, Chun corrected. A demonstration. Show the Devourers what they expect to see. A traditional military assault by superior warriors using conventional tactics. Give them something to focus their defenses on while my people do what they do best. And what happens to my warriors when your infiltration succeeds? Zektar demanded. When the spire starts to collapse, and we're still engaged with their entire defensive force. Captain Chen's expression became serious, and for the first time since he'd met her, Zektar saw something in her eyes that looked like regret. That's the part you're not going to like, she said quietly. There's no guarantee any of us survive this. But if we fail, the Devourers reach exponential growth phase. After that, it won't matter how many warriors die here. Entire civilizations will follow. Zektar stared at her, processing the implications of what she was asking. It went against every instinct he possessed as a squad leader. Vraxian military doctrine emphasized mutual support and shared risk. Leaders led from the front, and no warrior was expendable for the sake of the mission. But as he studied Captain Chen's face, he realized that she wasn't asking him to sacrifice his warriors for a mission. She was asking him to choose between certain death for a small group and possible extinction for entire species. "How long do you need?" he asked finally. 40 minutes from the start of your assault," she replied. "Maybe less if we get lucky. Maybe more if we encounter unexpected complications." Zektar felt his secondary hearts begin pumping combat stimulants through his system. 40 minutes was an eternity in sustained combat against overwhelming odds. But it was also possibly long enough. "We'll give you a distraction," he said. "But I want something in return. Name it. When this is over, if any of us survive, I want to know how you really do it," Zektar said. "How you fight wars against impossible odds and win. How you adapt to threats that should destroy you. How you turn weaknesses into advantages." Captain Chun extended her hand in that same greeting gesture she'd used when they first met, but this time Zektar understood that it meant something different. It wasn't just a greeting. It was a recognition between warriors who understood the cost of what they were about to do. "Deal," she said simply. 20 minutes later, Zektar led his warriors in a frontal assault against the devoured defensive positions that was everything Captain Chun had promised it would be: obvious, conventional, and tactically sound according to established military doctrine. His squad moved in standard formation, using their superior physical capabilities and advanced weapons to punch through the outer defensive perimeter with the kind of direct, honorable assault that his ancestors would have approved of. The Devourers responded exactly as Chun had predicted they would. Defensive units that had been spread throughout the spire's perimeter concentrated on the Vraxian assault, bringing overwhelming firepower to bear against what appeared to be the primary threat. Aerial units descended from their patrol routes to provide close support. Heavy assault units moved to intercept and contain the Vraxian advance. It was a textbook military response to a textbook military threat, and it would have been completely effective against any conventional assault force. But while the Devourers focused their attention on repelling the Vraxian attack, 12 human soldiers were moving through the gaps in their defensive network like ghosts. No energy signatures to detect, no coordinated communications to intercept, no formation patterns to analyze. Just individuals, each one finding their own way through the maze of organic architecture that surrounded the spire's base. Zektar caught glimpses of them as he fought his way deeper into the defensive perimeter. A flicker of movement in his peripheral vision as Sergeant Williams slipped past a patrol unit that was focused on the main battle. A brief muzzle flash from an impossible angle as Corporal Davies eliminated a sentry that might have detected one of his teammates. The subtle signs of sabotage as critical systems began to malfunction in ways that looked like random equipment failures rather than enemy action. They were invisible not because of technology or natural camouflage, but because they were doing something the Devourer's hive intelligence couldn't comprehend. They were fighting as individuals rather than as a military unit, using tactics that didn't exist in any database, adapting to obstacles in real time rather than following predetermined plans. The battle raged around Primary Node 7 for 38 minutes before the first signs of the human infiltration became apparent. It started as minor systems malfunctions, communication delays between defensive units, sensor equipment that provided contradictory readings, coordination protocols that began to lag behind the rapid pace of combat. Then, the demolition charges began to detonate. Zektar watched in amazement as sections of the spire's superstructure collapsed in precisely calculated sequences, each explosion triggering cascade failures that propagated throughout the entire structure. But these weren't random acts of sabotage. They were surgical strikes against specific structural components that had been identified and targeted by individuals who understood both engineering principles and Devourer construction techniques. The massive spire, which had seemed indestructible just an hour before, began to collapse under its own weight as critical support systems failed in exact sequence. Emergency protocols designed to protect the structure from damage instead amplified the destruction, as automated systems tried to compensate for failures that had been deliberately engineered to create maximum cascade effects. As Primary Node 7 died around them, taking with it the coordination systems that controlled Devourer operations across the entire continent, Zektar finally understood what Captain Chun had meant when she talked about adaptation. The humans hadn't just found a way to destroy an impossible target. They had turned the target's own strengths against it, using its sophisticated defensive systems to amplify their attack rather than resist it. But as impressive as their victory was, Zektar realized he still hadn't seen the thing that truly terrified him about fighting alongside humanity. He was about to. The collapse of Primary Node 7 should have been the end of their mission. With the Spire destroyed and the Continental Coordination Network severed, the Devourer forces across the Northern Hemisphere would be operating in isolation, unable to coordinate their defenses against the broader Allied assault. It was a victory beyond their most optimistic projections. But victory, Zektar was learning, meant something different to humans than it did to other species. As the dust settled around the ruins of the massive spire, Zektar expected Captain Chun and her squad to begin extraction procedures. The logical next step would be to return to their insertion point, signal for pickup, and report their success to the fleet commanders coordinating the planet-wide assault. They had accomplished their objective with minimal casualties and dealt a crippling blow to Devourer operations. Instead, Captain Chun was studying her tactical display with the same focused intensity she'd shown during their initial infiltration. Her squad had emerged from the spire's ruins like shadows becoming solid, each soldier appearing from impossible concealment with their equipment intact and their mission objectives completed. But instead of celebrating their success, they were regrouping for something else. Sergeant Williams, Chun called out over the squad comm. "What's the status on the data extraction from the communication nodes?" Williams consulted his portable analysis unit, its screen displaying streams of information that Zektar couldn't interpret. "Full spectrum download complete, Captain. We've got their entire tactical database, unit deployments, resource allocation, construction priorities, and communication protocols for every Devourer operation on the planet." "Outstanding," Chun replied, but her tone suggested this was expected rather than surprising. "Davies, what did you find in the central processing matrix?" Corporal Davies held up a collection of crystalline components that pulsed with the same bioluminescent pattern Zektar had seen in the smaller scouts. "Complete memory cores from the primary intelligence nodes," he reported. "If our analysis is correct, these contain strategic planning data for Devourer operations across multiple star systems." Zektar felt his combat instincts respond to something in the human's behavior that he couldn't quite identify. They weren't acting like soldiers who had just completed a successful mission. They were acting like predators who had just discovered a larger prey. "Captain," he called out, "we should begin extraction procedures. The longer we remain in this area, the greater the chance of encountering Devourer reinforcements." Chun turned toward him, and the expression on her face made Zektar's scales stand on end. It was the same predatory gleam he'd seen before, but magnified beyond anything he'd previously witnessed. She looked like a hunter who had just realized her prey was bigger and more valuable than she'd initially thought. "Actually, Battlemaster," she said, her voice carrying a quality that made his instinctive threat assessment systems activate. "We're not extracting yet. We're going hunting." "Hunting for what?" Zektar demanded, though something deep in his genetic memory was already screaming warnings. Captain Chun manipulated her tactical display to show the broader strategic picture. With Primary Node 7 destroyed, the Devourer forces that had been coordinated by its control systems were now operating independently. But instead of scattering or falling back to secondary positions, many of them were converging on specific locations that the intelligence data had revealed. "Resource processing centers," Chun explained, highlighting several installations scattered across the continent. "According to the data we extracted, the Devourers have been using this planet to refine raw materials for their expansion into the surrounding star systems. With their coordination network down, those facilities are vulnerable." "That's not our mission," Zektar pointed out, his warrior training emphasizing the importance of maintaining operational focus. "Our objective was to destroy the primary coordination node. Mission accomplished. Further operations should be planned and executed by Fleet Command." "Fleet Command is thinking like a conventional military force," Chun replied, her attention already shifting to target selection and approach routes. "They're planning to secure territory, establish defensive positions, and gradually push the Devourers off the planet through sustained operations over several months." She zoomed in on one of the processing facilities, its sprawling complex of organic architecture and mechanical systems clearly visible through satellite imagery. "But we have an opportunity to do something better. We can cripple their entire expansion operation before they have time to adapt to our tactics." Zektar stared at the tactical display, trying to understand what Shun was proposing. The processing facility she'd highlighted was easily 10 times the size of Primary Node 7, defended by thousands of Devourer units, and located deep in territory that their intelligence classified as heavily contested. Attacking it would require resources and coordination far beyond what their small combined unit could provide. "Captain," he said carefully, "that facility is beyond our capabilities. Even if we could somehow penetrate its defenses, we don't have the firepower to destroy an installation of that size." "We don't need to destroy it," Chen replied with that terrifying smile. "We just need to understand how it works." Over the next hour, Zektar watched as Captain Chen's squad began preparations for an operation that defied every principle of military logic he'd ever learned. Instead of planning an assault on the processing facility, they were planning to infiltrate it. Not to destroy it, but to study it. Not to eliminate the Devourer forces protecting it, but to avoid them entirely. It was by any rational assessment impossible. The facility was the size of a small city, crawling with Devourer units, and protected by defensive systems that made Primary Node 7 look like a minor outpost. Attempting to infiltrate it with 12 soldiers was beyond ambitious. It was delusional. But as Zektar observed their preparations, he began to recognize the same patterns he'd seen before their assault on the spire. The humans weren't approaching this as a conventional military operation. They were approaching it as a research project with extremely dangerous working conditions. Sergeant Williams had reconfigured his electronic warfare equipment for data extraction rather than sabotage. His goal wasn't to disrupt the facility's systems, but to copy them, to download every piece of information about Devourer resource processing, manufacturing capabilities, and expansion protocols. Corporal Davies had loaded his equipment with collection devices rather than weapons. Instead of ammunition, he carried sampling tools, analysis equipment, and storage containers designed to preserve Devourer biological samples under controlled conditions. Each member of the squad had transformed from a soldier into a specialist researcher, but one prepared to operate in a hostile environment where discovery meant certain death. They were planning to turn an enemy stronghold into a laboratory. "This is insane," Zektar said finally, his warrior pragmatism overcoming his growing fascination with human tactical thinking. "Even if you succeed in gathering this intelligence, how do you plan to extract it? How do you plan to survive long enough to make use of what you learn?" Captain Chin looked up from her equipment preparations, and Zektar saw something in her eyes that made him understand, for the first time, why his predator instincts continued to identify these humans as dangerous despite their apparent physical limitations. It wasn't just intelligence that made them effective warriors. It wasn't just adaptability or tactical innovation. It was something far more fundamental and infinitely more terrifying. They were willing to die for information. Not just willing to risk their lives for strategic advantage or tactical superiority. They were prepared to sacrifice themselves for the mere possibility of gaining knowledge that might, eventually, be useful to their species. They approached warfare not just as a contest of strength or skill, but as a learning opportunity that justified any level of personal risk. "Battlemaster," Chin said quietly, "what's the most dangerous predator on your homeworld?" The question seemed unrelated to their tactical situation, but Zektar answered automatically. "The Cathrak pack hunters. They're faster than most prey species, stronger than any individual defender, and smart enough to coordinate complex hunting strategies." "And how do your people deal with Cathrak packs?" "Avoidance, primarily," Zektar replied, wondering where this was leading. "When confrontation is unavoidable, we use superior weapons and defensive positions to overcome their natural advantages." Captain Chin nodded, as if this confirmed something she already knew. "The most dangerous predator on Earth isn't stronger or faster than other species," she said. "It's not particularly well armed by natural standards, and it doesn't have any obvious physical advantages that would make it a dominant hunter." She gestured toward her squad, busy with preparations that looked increasingly like scientific research rather than military operations. "The most dangerous predator on Earth is dangerous because it learns, because it adapts, because it turns every encounter, every challenge, every threat into an opportunity to become more effective." Zektar felt something cold settle in his chest as he began to understand what she was describing. "You're not just fighting the Devourers," he said slowly. "You're studying them, learning from them, using each engagement to gather intelligence that makes you more effective in the next engagement. Every species we've ever encountered makes the same mistake, Chun continued, her voice carrying a quality that made Zektar's threat assessment systems fire continuously. They assume that because we're physically inferior, we must be operating from a position of weakness. They focus on our limitations and miss our actual advantage. She stood up, shouldering her pack with practiced efficiency. Our advantage isn't that we're stronger or faster or more durable than other species. Our advantage is that we learn faster. We adapt faster. And we're willing to pay any price necessary to gain the knowledge that lets us win. As the combined unit moved toward the processing facility, Zektar found himself thinking about Captain Chen's words. He'd initially dismissed human capabilities because their physical limitations seemed obvious. But he was beginning to understand that he'd been looking at the wrong metrics. Physical strength was important in individual combat, but warfare between civilizations wasn't won by individual combat. It was won by the side that could learn, adapt, and innovate faster than their opponents. And humans, he was beginning to realize, had turned learning into a weapon more devastating than any technology. They didn't just fight their enemies, they studied them. They didn't just defeat them, they absorbed everything useful about their capabilities, their technologies, and their tactics. They turned every battle into a classroom and every enemy into a teacher, willing to pay any price in blood for the education. The processing facility loomed ahead of them, its organic architecture pulsing with malevolent life, and defended by forces that could crush their small unit without effort. But as Zektar watched the humans prepare for their impossible infiltration, he realized that the Devourers were about to face something they had never encountered before. They were about to be studied by a species that treated learning as an act of warfare, and warfare as an opportunity to learn. And Zektar was beginning to suspect that the most terrifying thing about that combination wasn't what the humans might discover. It was what they might become afterward. The infiltration of the processing facility took 18 hours. For the first 6 hours, Zektar maintained his position at the observation point Captain Chun had selected, monitoring communications traffic and watching for signs of discovery as the human squad disappeared into the sprawling complex of organic architecture and mechanical systems. His enhanced vision could occasionally catch glimpses of movement, a shadow that didn't belong, a brief reflection where none should exist. But for the most part, the humans had simply vanished into the facility as if they'd never existed. For the next 6 hours, he watched the Devourer units go about their normal operations, processing raw materials and constructing the components that would eventually become new ships for their expanding fleet. Thousands of the biomechanical constructs moved through the facility with hive mind coordination, each one perfectly adapted to its specific function in the larger operation. It was a remarkable display of organized efficiency, and under normal circumstances, Zektar would have found it professionally fascinating. But these weren't normal circumstances. Somewhere within that maze of alien technology and hostile forces, 12 humans were conducting what amounted to a scientific expedition in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. And with each passing hour, Zektar found himself more convinced that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history. The humans weren't just infiltrating an enemy stronghold. They were studying it from the inside, learning everything they could about Devourer capabilities, technologies, and operational procedures. They were treating one of the galaxy's most feared enemies as a research subject, willing to risk everything for the chance to gain knowledge that might prove useful in future conflicts. During the final 6 hours, Zektar began to understand what true terror felt like. It started as a subtle change in the facility's operational patterns. Systems that had been running smoothly began to show minor irregularities. Manufacturing processes that had been producing components at steady intervals started to experience small delays. Communication networks that had been operating with clockwork precision began to show microscopic variations in timing and frequency. To any casual observer, these would have looked like normal operational variations, the kind of minor inefficiencies that occurred in any complex system. But Zektar's enhanced analytical capabilities allowed him to detect the patterns beneath the apparent randomness, and what he saw made his combat glands flood his system with stress hormones. The humans weren't just studying the Devourer facility. They were systematically introducing modifications to its operations. Subtle changes that wouldn't trigger security protocols or alert the hive intelligence, but that would fundamentally alter how the facility functioned. They were rewriting the Devourer's own systems against them. Sergeant Williams had infiltrated the communication network and was introducing microscopic delays in data transmission that would cause coordination problems between different sections of the facility. The delays were too small to trigger error correction protocols, but large enough to disrupt the precise timing that allowed thousands of units to work together efficiently. Corporal Davies had accessed the resource allocation systems and was making tiny adjustments to material distribution that would cause certain manufacturing processes to receive slightly inferior raw materials. Again, the changes were too small to trigger alarms, but significant enough to introduce weaknesses into the components being produced. Other team members had infiltrated different systems: power distribution, environmental control, structural maintenance, and security protocols, each one making small, subtle modifications that looked like normal operational variations, but would combine to create cascade failures throughout the entire facility. But the most terrifying thing wasn't what they were doing to the Devourer's systems. It was how they were doing it. Each modification was being made with perfect understanding of how Devourer technology functioned. The humans had infiltrated systems they'd never seen before, analyzed technologies that no other species had ever successfully reverse-engineered, and understood operational principles that had baffled galactic intelligence services for decades. And they were doing it in real time during active combat operations while surrounded by thousands of hostile forces. They weren't just adapting to Devourer technology. They were mastering it faster than the Devourers themselves could respond. When the facility finally began to experience serious malfunctions, it happened with a swiftness that caught even Zektar off guard. One moment, the complex was operating normally despite the minor irregularities he'd been monitoring. The next, entire sections were shutting down as cascade failures propagated through systems that the Devourers had considered completely secure. Manufacturing lines ground to a halt as power distribution networks failed in precisely calculated sequences. Communication arrays went silent as data corruption spread through the facility's information systems like a virus. Defensive systems turned against each other as modified security protocols identified critical infrastructure as potential threats. Within 30 minutes, the entire facility had transformed from a center of Devourer industrial might into a chaotic maze of failing systems and confused defenders. And through it all, Zektar could detect signs of continued human activity. Small groups moving through the facility, collecting samples, downloading data, and continuing their systematic study of Devourer capabilities even as everything collapsed around them. They were learning from the very process of destruction they had initiated. When Captain Chen's voice finally came through the comm system, her tone was calm and professional despite the chaos visible in the facility behind her. Battlemaster Zektar, this is Captain Chen. Extraction Point Alpha in 20 minutes. Bring the transport. Zektar activated the emergency beacon that would summon their pickup shuttle, but his attention remained focused on the burning facility. Captain, what's your status? The entire complex appears to be experiencing catastrophic system failures. Affirmative, Chen replied, and there was something in her voice that made Zektar's predator instinct scream. Mission objectives exceeded all expectations. We've gathered enough intelligence on Devourer operations to fundamentally change how we approach this war. What kind of intelligence? The kind that's going to terrify both our enemies and our allies, Chen replied, and this time Zektar could hear the satisfaction in her voice. We know how they think now. We know how they build things. We know how they coordinate operations across multiple systems. And, most importantly, we know how to make them fight each other. The extraction proceeded smoothly, with the human squad emerging from the facility's ruins like ghosts materializing from nightmare. Each soldier carried equipment containers that hadn't been part of their original loadout, storage devices filled with Devourer technology, biological samples, and data cores containing information that had been purchased with the kind of risks that most species would consider unacceptable. But as their transport lifted off from the planet's surface, carrying them away from the destruction they had orchestrated, Zektar finally understood what had been bothering him about human warfare since the moment he'd first met Captain Chen. It wasn't their physical capabilities that made them dangerous. It wasn't their technology or their tactics or their willingness to take risks. It was something far more fundamental and infinitely more terrifying. They treated every enemy as a teacher, every conflict as a learning opportunity, and every victory as information to be applied to the next challenge. They didn't just fight wars, they evolved through them, becoming more effective with each engagement regardless of the cost in blood and lives. Most species fought to preserve their existing way of life, their current capabilities, their established territories. Humans fought to become something more than they had been before the conflict began. They used warfare itself as a mechanism for rapid evolutionary adaptation, willing to pay any price for the knowledge that would make them more effective predators. And the most terrifying part was that they were getting better at it. "Captain," Zektar said as their transport broke through the planet's atmosphere and headed for the fleet rendezvous point, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, Battlemaster. When this war is over, when the Devourers have been defeated or driven back, what happens then?" Captain Chen looked at him with those predator's eyes, and for a moment Zektar thought he saw something that might have been sympathy. "Then we take everything we've learned and apply it to the next threat," she said simply. "And we become something more than we were before. And if there's no next threat?" Chen's smile was small and cold and utterly without mercy. "Battlemaster," she said quietly, "in a galaxy full of predators competing for the same resources, there's always a next threat. The question isn't whether we'll face another enemy. The question is whether we'll be ready for them when they come." As their transport docked with the fleet command vessel, Zektar found himself thinking about the implications of what he'd witnessed. The humans hadn't just defeated a superior enemy through cleverness or luck. They had systematically studied that enemy, learned everything useful about their capabilities, and turned that knowledge into weapons that would be effective against any similar threat they might encounter in the future. They had fought a war not just to win, but to evolve. And as he watched Captain Shun and her squad report to Fleet Command, carrying with them intelligence that would reshape how the galaxy understood warfare itself, Zektar realized that he had finally experienced true terror. Not the fear of death or pain or defeat. Those were things that any warrior could face with courage and honor. But the terror of understanding that he had allied himself with a species that treated conflict as an opportunity for rapid evolutionary adaptation, that learned from every enemy they faced, and that would continue to become more dangerous with each passing generation. He had seen humans go to war, and he understood now why the galaxy whispered their name in the darkness between stars. It wasn't because they were stronger or faster or more durable than other species. It was because they never stopped learning how to kill things more efficiently. And in a universe full of potential threats that made them the most dangerous species of all, the war against the Devourers would continue for several more months. But its outcome was no longer in question. Not because the Allied forces had superior numbers or better technology, but because one species among them had learned everything they needed to know about how their enemy functioned. And they would use that knowledge to ensure that nothing like the Devourers would ever threaten the galaxy again. Zektar returned to his homeworld after the war with commendations for valor and a profound understanding of what true warfare looked like. He retired from active military service and became a teacher, sharing with young Vraxian warriors the lessons he had learned about adaptation, innovation, and the price of knowledge. But he never forgot the look in Captain Chen's eyes when she spoke about the next threat, the next enemy, the next opportunity to evolve through conflict. And sometimes, in the quiet hours between the stars, he wondered if the galaxy would survive having humans as its protectors, or if protection and predation were ultimately the same thing.